But some people, it's like the collapse of civilization as we know it globally is basically already cemented in. There's too many things that, like, thresholds that we've passed, and there's no sign of anyone making any changes to that trajectory. Long before we got to the point where we had actually taken out all the trees, civilization is going to suffer major stress and collapse, because long before you cut down all the trees, you're already going to start impacting biodiversity and the systems that govern weather and droughts and the soil and pollinators, all the things that our food systems, rely on. They rely on natural systems, right? All right, this is Justin McAfee with Collapse Curriculum Podcast, and I'm here with my co-host, Mike Paxinos.
Hi, glad to be here.
How's it going?
Yeah, it's good. How you doing?
Doing pretty good. And it's interesting because Mike is a former math professor. I wouldn't have gotten through college without this man right here. He made it easy, and really, I think math is super important for understanding a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Which is the topic of collapse, which is a fun topic that everyone is really excited about. It's a serious topic, but it's very important because I think a lot of people, they're, like you said, they're trying to put food on the table, and they're not trying to worry about crazy stuff like climate change and all these other things. But it's important to talk about. I think a few things I just want to start out by talking about here. This is our first episode of the Collapse Curriculum Podcast. I write a Substack called Collapse Curriculum, and I'm almost done with a book called The 10 Myths of Progress. And on this Substack, I write about the topic of environmental destruction on the planet mostly, but also other ways in which the systems that we rely on, like supply chains and things like that, are struggling, if not on their way to collapse. And so I wanted to just briefly bring forward a few points to set the stage. One is that, we could say that collapse, a lot of times people think about collapse as a future thing, you see in the movies. You see Terminator, and that's a thing that happens in the future. In fact, people from the future come back to try to stop it, right? But in reality, it's a process, just like most things.
Right.
It begins, and it happens over time. It doesn't happen on one single day. I mean, obviously, there's like an asteroid hitting the planet that would be considered more like an immediate event
kind of thing. Yeah.
But that's, that's generally not what we're talking about here. We're talking about things that are in the process of happening, like deforestation, carbon pollution, and things like that. My hope for this podcast and for my Substack is, to kind of create awareness about it, but also like a guide for how we can react or respond to the situation. Some people call it a polycrisis.
Solutions to it, not just describing it. We have to bring it out and expose it, but what can we do about it? And there are things we can do. So, exactly.
Yeah. That brings up a point. A lot of times people talk about, you're a math guy, so maybe you can speak to this a little bit. People have talked about, okay, you have a problem, and usually in math, a lot of times there's a solution. And sometimes there is what is called a predicament. And how would you, and so to give you a little framework, it's basically the idea is that sometimes there isn't necessarily a solution. There could be responses, but there isn't like a clear cut solution, if you know what I mean.
Sure. Yeah. It's, and that, especially with applied mathematics, not everything in the universe is predictable to the T. I mean, we can come up with theories and like in number theory, we can predict things and exactly how they're going to be. But when you talk about the real world, you're not going to see a perfect square that was in nature out in the real world. I mean, we usually make those things, or the Earth is a sphere, but it's not completely a sphere. It's just spherical. And so we. When it comes to applied mathematics, we simply find what the best option can be and the most perfect, and that's what we shoot for. Like in electronics, for example, there's a thing in there where you can have the resistance of current, and but they want to know, well, what about infinite resistance without actually stopping the current? It's like, well, that's kind of impossible. That would stop the current, But there's still, but the thing is, you have a goal that if you want to get some good resistance, you at least know what to shoot for. And that's really the best way we can do it is, we don't expect perfection, but let's at least make a perfect model, come up with a perfect model, and see how close we can get to it. That's realistic.
Yeah.
That's a great way of looking at it because, we can come up with models, theories, ideas.
Right.
And that may not, in fact, we can probably expect that won't happen. But if you shoot for that, then at least you're going in the right direction.
you got to reference it to something. Otherwise, you're just kind of floating the sea without a rudder and you just don't know where to park port, So it's not something like people say, well, we can't build utopia and it's, well, we're not supposed to, what we want to do is you just use that as a reference of how close can we get to that, and then live our lives the best we can.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that we can talk about on this podcast is, talking about, well, what is the perfect model? If you look at what I think the political leaders in the world, or even private profiteers like Elon Musk or someone like that,
right,
what they're proposing is not really much different than the status quo. It seems to me, like with climate change, for example, they're like, okay, well, we'll make electric cars and we'll make solar panels. But they're really not even addressing like, okay, yeah, that's part of it, but there's a lot of things that it's going to be hard to do that with. And it's also going to create a lot of other problems with the minerals that are required to do the batteries, to build the solar panels, and then
the mining,
ecological
right?
damage. The mining.
There's probably a lot of mining that goes on with it. I'm not up with the EVs, but I can't imagine to get the cobalt and lithium that you're not going to have to destroy some ecology for that.
Yeah, and that's one thing that got me into this topic initially was going out and looking at some of the areas in the desert in Nevada where I used to live and where I met you. You go out into those landscapes, and for the most part, it's one of the few places in the lower 48 states that hasn't been either urbanized or completely changed for agriculture.
Yeah.
If you go a lot of places in the country, it's, there's either monocrops like corn, or there's timber forests that are being used for timber, and then, or there's cattle ranching, or there's cities.
Right.
But out here, there's still pretty large areas that aren't like that, and they're talking about basically, wiping out. I think there's about 9 million acres in Nevada that are open, at least, to potentially being used for solar panels, for example.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, Nevada is 85% of the land in Nevada is government owned, I think.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, we get 15%. But, you pack up every inch on it as much as you can, I guess. But, yeah.
But what does that do to the ecology to put that many black silicon solar panels and the transmission lines and all that?
Yeah, no, it does. And I always wondered, But we can't have progress, right, unless we destroy something. Unfortunately, I wish that wasn't the case. But I'm wondering, what balance can we do? I mean, we should probably redefine what does it mean for progress to begin with? Does it have to be over technology like we have it? I mean, AI is now on the forefront in that people don't see it because out of sight, out of mind. But it does take a lot of power, and that power, energy and stuff, it takes a lot more than Google does. That's for sure. And just saying thank you to ChatGPT and what the response is, that's like the electricity it takes, just the power it takes for ChatGPT to even say you're welcome. So, but it's progress, and it does make life easier to a degree, but at the same time, what balance? There's got to be a balance. There's got to be something that we can't just overwhelm the earth with just to make our lives simple every single day, and that's what
that's the question.
Yeah.
That's the
and that's
question.
where
What is?
And that's what I was going up with. What is the perfect model that we can reach for? Let's just figure it out. I don't know, what would that look like? What would the perfect utopian look like between the two? And then just how close can we get to it realistically?
Yeah. So that's one of the questions that happens for me is, okay, so we're building these solar panels to replace fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, but by the way, now we have AI and the demand for energy has soared. So we're not really doing it to replace fossil fuels. We could talk about theoretical technologies, which may or may not come to fruition. I mean, like fusion or something.
Yeah.
There's fission that does exist, but it has problems. So, I wonder if we've got one of the myths of progress that we've gotten into is we just believe that there's going to be a technological solution. We just assume that.
Right.
And is that the case? Is that sort of I don't know. Maybe it's based on the last 200 years since Thomas Malthus. If you're familiar, are you familiar with Thomas Malthus?
Oh, the name is familiar to me. I don't know why I can't recall who that is though.
Sometimes people say you're Malthusian if you believe that there are limits to usually population growth is the big one that refers to, because he talked about the population of the planet is getting too high and there's not enough resources, and then we found fossil fuels, right?
Right.
And so that changed the dynamics of everything because we were able to then extract much more resources than we previously could.
That's a good point.
So it was, fossil fuels changed the trajectory of potentially going in the direction of collapse at that time. It enabled massive agricultural production, for example. And then, of course, it enabled refrigeration and technologies like that to make it so that we can feed more people. And so you see the population of the world blow up after, I think there was, I want to say 2 billion people, or maybe 1 billion people in 1800 when he was around. And then I think I had the numbers actually on my article. Let's just say it was close to a billion. So in 1800, 200 years ago, 225 years ago, 100 years ago, 1.2 billion, 1.28 billion, 50 years ago, 2.56 billion, 25 years ago was 5.12 billion, and then it's 8 billion today.
Jeez. Yeah.
In 2023. So that is, and what enabled that, of course, is technology. Mostly fossil fuels, I would say, but everything that has come through that technology, that is, because I think fossil fuels, inherently enables industrialism,
right?
And things like that. So
yeah.
And so the assumption, I think, because of that trend, because of that experience, is that there's going to be something else, because I think we're hitting the threshold of what fossil fuels can carry, because
number one, the carbon pollution.
Yeah.
There are people, we're already past 1.5 degrees Celsius increase since the Industrial Revolution, right? Since we started and that's like unprecedented in the history of the planet.
Is that surface temperature of the Earth? Is that what that means?
The global surface temperature is currently approaching, not permanently exceeding, the 1.5 C threshold for warming above pre-industrial levels.
Mm. Yeah.
I think it did it for the first time for an average for a year in 2024.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah. But the point is, it's not declining. There's a nice, I don't want to say the word nice, but it's a gradual incline, and it's not backing up.
And then there's different, talk about the sensitivity of the planet to carbon pollution. There's some people think it's like it could go, to 2 degrees Celsius with a pretty short time, maybe 3 or 4 by the end of the century. Then there's people who are saying it could be as high as 8 to 10 Celsius, more long term.
Wow.
So that's the question, is like, if we can't use that technology to maintain the current level of sophistication and complexity, is there another one? And if there isn't, then what do we do?
Right. Yeah. Wow. I didn't know it was that, or at least the future of that was that bad. But yeah, I mean, there's got to be, and I know people are working for new technologies out there, and they have been for decades, and so it's nothing new. But for some reason, we can't just seem to find something that doesn't cause more harm than good.
Right.
And or even what it takes to, even if the technology is better, or I'm sorry, if the energy source is better, it just seems like there's so much exploitation that has to be done in order to get that to happen. The mines in Congo to get the cobalt, there's like 12-year-olds working in there, and they're happy to do it because they're so poor, but it's still, it's still a dangerous thing. So I wish we can come up with something. It would be good if there was some, and this is where politics gets in, and I think that's a shame, because we're looking at something that affects the whole world here, and unfortunately, like, for example, if you mention climate change and we have to do something, then you're automatically labeled a liberal, a Democrat, or a snowflake, or whatever, or if you're someone that's against climate, then you're automatically labeled a Republican, and so
a fascist.
It's and it's like, at some point, people, it's like you can't put politics on science. It doesn't work like that. Science will do what it does regardless of what we believe politically, and I wish that people could just step back, zoom out, and look how it's affecting their personal lives, not their party.
Yeah, and I think so. For the purposes of this podcast, and I'm glad you're here, because I think the idea was, this conversation, I have this conversation in my own bubble a lot, which is other people who, what we call, they're collapse aware. So collapse awareness is the awareness of, I think it can be defined differently for different people, but some people it's like the collapse of civilization as we know it globally is basically already, what do you call it? Cemented in.
Yeah.
There's too many things that, like, thresholds that we've passed, and there's no sign of anyone making any changes to that trajectory.
Right.
So we kind of getting into probabilities here, which I remember learning about probabilities in your class in college.
I remember you being the only one paying attention. So
yeah, I was like glued to what you were saying, because you know what I mean. Because it does apply mathematics applies so much. And there's this article where these scientists, I'm not sure what their science was, I could look at it, but they were saying that there was a 90% chance that civilization would collapse by 2050.
Jeez.
And that was based on deforestation. So this isn't even climate change. This is just the mathematics of. Now we could talk about this a little bit. The current rate of deforestation, if we were to continue that rate, then they predict that just on those numbers and how many forests there are, that the forests would be gone in 100 to 200 years. Now we could certainly slow down before we got to that point. And I'm guessing we will, but it isn't, if you look at like American politics, they're actually accelerating deforestation. And I think you can see that all over the planet.
Yeah.
So the trend, there's no indication that trend is changing. In fact, it seems like it's getting worse. And then you look at long before we got to the point where we had actually taken out all the trees, civilization is going to suffer major stress and collapse, because long before you cut down all the trees, you're already going to start impacting biodiversity and the systems that govern weather and droughts and the soil and the pollinators, all the things that our food systems, rely on. They rely on natural systems, right? So we're talking about just not having enough food anymore. It may be like, okay, we could build these large domes or something like.
Right.
I can see people coming up with things, but then it gets very science fiction-y. And the question, with all the other things that are happening, what are the likelihood of those things occurring?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and you're absolutely right. The hardest thing, and I don't know if this is just a human trait. I think it'd be great to talk to someone that's into psychology, but out of sight, out of mind. If we don't see directly the effect in front of us, then we continue because we don't necessarily think we're doing anything dangerous. You know what I mean? And it's like eating meat. I eat meat and I love it, but I also know how what the slaughterhouses are like. And I mean, I haven't been to one, but I'm aware of it. Now I wonder what would that do if we all, what would we think of eating meat once we saw the slaughterhouse, how they treat these animals and how they die and so forth. So, the point I'm making, I'm not saying let's all be vegans and vegetarians. That's not my point. I'm not saying that at all. I doubt I would ever become a vegetarian. I mean, I was once and it just didn't work out. It didn't work out at all for me. But either way, the only point I'm trying to make is that if unless we can really see things in front of us, our own actions and how that affects it personally in front of our eyes, it's going to be a lot difficult for us to slow down.
I agree. I think that's one of the reasons why this just adds to the probability that maybe the trajectory we're on is collapse, because we can get into the article that I wrote that I sent to you, right? If we look at the historical rise and fall of civilizations that flourished,
right,
only eventually to collapse, right? What are some of those trends? One of them, I'll just say it right off the bat, is that they tend to double down on the things that once made them strong, the things that built the empire or the civilization to begin with.
Right, yeah.
And sometimes it is those things that are actually detrimental. Yeah. But even though they're detrimental, the trends, if you look at history, is that those things, they tend to double down on those things even though they're detrimental.
Yeah, yeah. Because they work so well, but it never occurs to them that there's an expiration date and how well it works. So it's kind of a catch-22. We need to eat, but at the same time, we're destroying the same food that we need to eat. You know what I mean? And it's just like I said, there's got to be some balance here where we look for what does progress should look like, or success. What does it mean to be successful? Everyone has their own point of view. I mean, Elon Musk, obviously, he's very successful. Versus maybe I consider myself successful. I'm no billionaire, but I have a wife and great kids, and I live comfortably, and I consider myself successful, and I don't have filthy rich. So everyone has their own idea of it, and but maybe we should kind of define it a little bit more, that it doesn't, where the consequences of our success doesn't, like you said, doesn't double down, where it comes back and destroys the same things that we use to get our success.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I would like to do on this podcast and in my writing is offer. So, like in my book, The 10 Myths of Progress, in each chapter, I talk about a myth of progress that society at large tells us is what progress is, and then I offer like a counter narrative or an alternative vision of what success really looks like. And it's definitely my opinion, but it's based on what I know about the limits of this planet. It's a finite planet, right? It's not an infinite planet. It may have. I mean, if you think about the material resources that are available in the crust of the earth that are viably accessible to our extraction industries, there's a very finite amount of that. Probably much less so than people have any idea about, generally speaking. And so just realizing that limit exists defines partially some of my values. Okay. And then, like when it comes to what you were talking about with eating meat, I personally, and I have lots of friends who are vegan or vegetarian who think that is crucial. And I think to an extent they make a point, but I think my point would be, I don't agree with factory farming. I don't believe in the slaughterhouses. But if people, for example, were to raise their own chickens, or sheep or goats or whatever, and utilize those animals for food, that, first of all, it's much more humane than what you see in a factory farm, and it's probably more sustainable too.
Right.
And there's ways to have smaller scale types of food ways. And I wrote about food ways actually in a recent article on my Substack, where I was talking about learning from, like traditional people, indigenous people's food ways, where they rely on local food production and things that are grown, locally,
right?
Instead of these international supply chains where I've seen things like they grow almonds in Indonesia, they ship them to Guatemala to be packaged, and then they ship them to the United States to be sold or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a waste, but it's good for profits because they can do it in bulk. They can exploit the third world for labor, and so when the goal is, which seems to be the status quo, right? The goal is profits. Then you're not going to have sustainable systems because the value is different.
Yeah, and the profits are usually just to the handful of people. It's not like you and we're not. I mean, I don't get a dime from Tesla. I don't get it. Why do I care? I mean, and then same with the almonds, your example. So when you have all this enormous wealth that's into the hands of the few, the rest of us just kind of, we just want to live our lives, and we put things aside, like they make their profits. How else are we going to eat unless we do it their way? I like the idea of local farming, doing your own stuff, but then again, it takes money to buy land. I mean, there's a lot of, in Nevada, it's very expensive to buy a lot and a house that can contain all that. And, most people in the middle class really just can't, they have to be condensed into a, what do you want to call this? A housing complex, the developers where they make a bunch of houses all within 2 inches of each other. Yeah. And so it's just a difficult, and, I do think corporations have a huge part of that. They're more of our new legislators, not really the politicians, but the corporate empires that we have here. They're pretty much our new legislators, I think. The only difference is we can't vote for them. As a matter of fact, Apple, I guess, I didn't know this, and I was reading last night that Apple's GDP alone, its revenue or profit margin, is actually larger than Finland's GDP as a whole. And that's just one. That's just one company here. That's not even. I'm not talking about all the corporations combined. I'm just talking about one. So it's, America's turned into the global headquarters for corporations, and I really think that they've done more to legislate than our politicians have.
Yeah. I would definitely characterize it as a corporate state for sure. Or you could say it's an oligarchy.
Yeah.
With the appearance of choice and democracy. That's one of the chapters in my book is actually the myth of democracy. And, I think it's, you can criticize even the beginning of it, but at least it set out to create a form of government that had checks and balances, that allowed people to vote and have representatives
right.
and, and stuff like that. But nowadays it's, the person that's, the two people from both sides are usually chosen by the elites of the party. They're well funded. And so we have a choice between two people that corporations have hedged their bets on both sides of. So what's the difference?
Yeah.
The difference is they present. I mean, you can tell by what's happened with this shooting of Charlie Kirk that the differences that they present between the left and the right is so enormous. But in reality, the two political parties are virtually identical, except for when it comes to things that the ruling class or the wealthy ruling elites benefit from. They don't care whether you have an abortion or not, or whether you're religious or not, or trans or not. They don't care about that stuff. So they let these culture wars divide the country while they take all the money, right?
Yeah. Well, that's true. I mean, it's, on the best, I've always said this, and it seems like it's a point that people don't want to take serious enough, is that the best way to combat that is to just simply learn to think for yourself, critically think. I mean, and critical thinking it's a skill. All right. I mean, and that's one thing that we have to understand. Just like if you learn a musical instrument, you got to practice, and there's a skill behind it. There's certain things you have to do. You don't just pick it up and start playing, Mozart or whatever. And it's the same thing when it comes to critical thinking. Thales from ancient Greek was the first one in history that was considered to be the first actual scientist that looked at things objectively. Before that, it was just more of how you felt. It was just, there were gods of Zeus, and it made sense if you just said lightning came from this guy Zeus. And it just, whereas Thales, back then, this is like 2500 BC or 600 BC or something like that. Not 2500, 2500 years ago, but 600 BC, whenever he was around. But, it takes a lot. It took a lot for him to get past that, to get past the mold that we in before he could start finally thinking and pursuing real knowledge for its own sake. And even today, we're still not there. I mean, most of society is a knee-jerk reaction. No one, I mean, do we really, you look at the division like you were talking about, it's emotional. It's people are emotional, and it's any kind of problem that's out there, they don't want to zoom out and look at critical thinking and learn how to critical think. There's a method to it, and it's not something you just pick up. It's not a skill that you just pick up one morning and just go with it. So,
yeah, that's why I'm enjoying hearing about your school that you're working on, because I think that's one thing. I don't think I got critical thinking until Philosophy 102, which was a critical thinking
Yeah.
class in college. You know,
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about any of that stuff.
We always
you
thought
know-
we were smart until we figured out we're not, and and it was the same with me. When I was in college, it's like I thought I knew everything, and then I get to philosophy, logic. It's like, yeah, I'm pretty dumb. I really am. It's a good feeling though. It really is. It gives you humility, and the less you know, or I'm sorry, the more you research things, you realize how less you really know. And I mean, it's like with me with math. I've done math for 20 something years, and I would tell you, I'm still about maybe this much of what there is to know about math of all the 25 years I've spent with it. It's just the more I learn about it, the more I realize how less I know about it. And really, I wish that's what people would look at themselves with their own thing, and they'll realize, we got a serious problem here with climate change, and it has nothing to do with whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. That's nature's going to do what it's going to do, regardless of our beliefs, and just got to learn to think, figure it out.
It's sort of that Dunning-Kruger effect. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I have.
It's like the more you know about the topic, then the less
you know
confident
about
are.
it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it is
But
true.
the less you know about the topic, the more confident, like astronomically,
Yeah,
more
and
confident you are.
The loudest person in the room is usually the one that's the most ignorant, and the one that screams the most is the one that knows the least. And it tends to be that way, And I don't. Again, that's a psychology thing. It would be nice to hear someone's knows a lot about that, but it does make. I mean, I personally have seen it, especially as a teacher. I've I would teach the beginning level of math. Like, I don't remember, not with you, not your class that I had you in, but it was another class that was basic math and stuff. And I would have these students arrogant coming in and say, yeah, I already know how to do all this. I had algebra 2 in high school, and they can't multiply two negatives together. And it's like, how did you get to algebra? You can't even, and here you are bragging that you know this, you know that. You don't know anything, all right? So just relax and take a mimosa or whatever and just take it easy and just listen, okay? Because you don't know what you're doing. And so it
was amazing how much I'd forgotten because I took math in high school as well, but
yeah,
all
these are
these
18-year-olds
years
like just coming right out of high school and they know everything.
Okay.
And it's just yeah. You ever want to know an answer to something? You just ask an 18-year-old; they know everything. So
that's true. That's true. All right, so I'll tell you what. Let's go ahead and we'll summarize. We'll talk about this article a little bit more. I wrote this article. It was Common Threads in Societies That Collapse. And this was Jared Diamond. He wrote a book called Collapse. And he did a TED Talk, which I can link here in the podcast. But you can look it up where Jared Diamond talks about collapse in his TED Talk.
Okay.
And
sounds good.
And I basically just like highlighted one part of it because I thought it was really interesting. So one thing that he said was that when a society collapses, it tends to be like rapid.
Tends to be what?
Within rapid. So within a few decades of when it starts, it tends to finish. So like the examples he gave were, within a decade or two after a society hits its peak in power and population, it tends to collapse. So
is that begins to collapse or does collapse? Because I know in the history of Rome, a lot of historians think it took like 2 centuries for Rome to. I mean, they kind of targeted when it started, but to a degree, but it took like 2 centuries for it to finally vanish.
Yeah, so I think you could argue that there was signs of collapse going back much further. But I think what Diamond is saying is that, including with the Western Roman Empire especially, that there was rapid collapse within a few decades of when it reached its peak of power and population.
Oh, I
so
see.
the examples, like the Soviet Union, for example, it was it achieved the pinnacle of their global power by 1980s, and then it quickly collapsed by the early 90s.
Yeah.
Now you could look back probably over the decades and point to reasons why,
Right.
But you don't see the rapid collapse of it until the peak.
Mm-hmm.
So, one question is, when is the peak coming? But either way, the point is that it tends to be rapid. Okay.
Yeah.
So you see a rapid decline. There may have been other indicators, but there's a rapid decline. The other example is the Mayan civilization. Again, within a decade or so of their peak population and construction of their greatest pyramids, with the Western Roman Empire, they had significant power through the 4th century until it experienced a rapid decline within just a few decades during the 5th century. So rapid decline does seem to come on. Even though you can say collapse is a process, it's also something that we will see. When it does happen, it tends to be rapid.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, it's scary. I wonder then if we look at this as in America, if the peak maybe is now. I don't know. I mean, the wealth is enormous that we have, so maybe we are at a peak. I would like to wonder though, when did democracy versus the empire wealth, like what I mean, like, did our democracy basically fall already? We just don't know it. Like, I'm thinking as soon as the corporations moved in, which I'm thinking like in the 90s. That's when I'm doing my research, post World War II era, and you had the American dream, and people had their freedom. Things were a lot less expensive. You can get a house. You can have one parent working. And you weren't living luxury, but you can certainly live in a nice place, a nice house, and raise a family. Post World War II era, but then something shifted, and I think it was post Soviet Union, post Cold War, that we had that victory over, and I'm guessing the 90s, because that's when the internet started and corporations just blew up. Apple, Amazon, a lot of things happened during that time. And we moved from the legislation of democracy from our politicians into corporations. And those corporations just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I'm wondering if our democracy, and I know it sounds doom and gloom, but just because we vote doesn't necessarily mean we have a voice. And it just doesn't. Because unless we can get these corporations to stop telling politicians what to do, I'm just wondering, what is the difference between our democracy now versus corporate-led America? Can the two cohabitate?
So there's a book by David Harvey called A Brief History of Neoliberalism, and he lays that out pretty well. I'm sure can be different theories, but in that book he talks about I think you're right in terms of when you can start to see it, but they started working behind the scenes in like the late 70s. I think probably the Reagan administration had a lot to do with privatizing a lot of things that were part of the public domain. Cutting taxes and regulations on corporations, and then maybe appointing judges that believed in this ideology. So by the time you get to like Citizens United, which was a Supreme Court decision, I don't know if you're familiar with Citizens United, but it basically said that it gave corporations personhood, and it gave them freedom of speech. And basically with that, they also ruled that like campaign finance laws that restricted corporations from giving donations were unconstitutional.
Yeah.
And that was a big game changer, because before that, there was some effort by the government to restrict the influence of corporations on American politics. And the Supreme Court, and they were conservatives, but I also think it's less so much about being Republican and more so about the people that were in charge at the time. Appointing people who were ideologically believing in this way, And then, I think the Democratic Party basically just starts to go in that direction itself. And,
Right.
at some point, you saw even during the Clinton administration, you start to see this move towards deregulation as well.
Right. Yeah.
That kind of stuff, balancing the budget, lowering the budget, which, I mean, obviously, like that's reasonable to some degree to balance the budget, but the question is like on whose back, right?
Yeah.
Are we cutting military spending and stuff like that, or subsidies for corporations, or are we cutting, little old ladies' food stamps and healthcare or something?
Yeah. No, I mean, there's always someone that's going to be exploited and for progress, for the sake of progress. But it goes back to that same question, what's the balance? Where we want to, like, especially in medicine, we want to come up with ways to help each other medically and diseases, to fight the diseases and all that. And it's going to take technology to do that. But there's got to be a way where we can balance who gets exploited and what gets exploited. At the same time, we can make advancements in the medicine that we need to help, to cure some of these diseases that are going around.
And we could, and I think like that, you get into, there's probably researchers at universities that is their aim. And then you have pharmaceutical companies, and you wonder to what extent, between those two, what actually, occurs. And what are the values and the goals. But this goes into what we could talk about. So there's three things that Jared Diamond was talking about that is a trend. One of them was the rapid collapse. Another is this short-term gain versus long-term well-being, that societies that are collapsing, they have this internal conflict between the short-term interests of the powerful rule-making elite and the long-term well-being of the society as a whole. And what generally tends to happen is that the people who are the ruling elite, the rule-making elite, they're more interested in their own short-term self-interest, and that's what happens. Not there isn't a shift towards the long-term well-being. So our present trend certainly seems to mirror the trends that we see in historical collapses.
Yeah.
So that's one of those things. That's why it's interesting to look at Diamond's work and looking at, okay, here's all these civilizations that have collapsed, which I quoted Henry Kissinger at the beginning, like that's the rule, not the exception, collapses.
Right.
And so if we're looking at history as, the guide of what happens when people do X, Y, and Z, what we're seeing is we're doing all the same things presently. So it's an indicator to me of the probabilities of what will occur.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. It's, I think in America we have short-term memories here, and maybe that has to do a lot with the media, the social media, because we get that dopamine rush when we have just short flashes of information, and we go on and scroll the next thing on TikTok or something like that, and you know what I mean. And it's just our attention span, I don't believe, is as long as it once was, and so with that short-term memory, we put aside some of the things that history has already should have taught us by now, and it makes it contributes to that collapse that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that was the third point that Diamond makes here is that these societies have strongly held values.
Yeah.
And I think you know what I mean. And it's sort of a paradox that the very values and beliefs that made this society strong and powerful do not serve them well when reaching tipping points. And so, because a lot of times collapses occur because of strain on resources and various reasons like that. So the takeaway for me, if we look at American society, like you're saying, we have, not only do we have short attention spans, like you were saying, we have values too, that we value like economic growth. We value being world leaders. We value having power.
I mean, we double down on capitalism, consumption, progress, and and that goes to this is just a personal question that I've always asked, and I don't, is how easy do we need to live? Right now we live a pretty, technology's made a lot of things easy for us in a good way and also in bad ways. Like I think in a good way, it's great that we can connect with people around the world. You and I can do this. You live up in Oregon. I'm here in Nevada. So, technology does definitely. But I'm just wondering, how simple do we have to live our lives? I mean, can't we, where we're just to the point of complete laziness? I mean, there's got to be a way where, it's like going to the gym and you just sit there on one of the machines. You don't do anything. It's like there should be a point where we shouldn't have things too easy for ourselves. But with the capitalism, that's the whole point, is that the profit margin happens when we make things simple for the consumer, and then more consumers, then more selling, and more consuming, and et cetera, et cetera. So,
yeah, it's interesting because it seems like, there's a great documentary about this. It's called Century of the Self. And I think the episode is called The Happiness Machines. And it's about American marketing and public relations. It centers kind of this guy named Edward Bernays, who is the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He's Austrian.
Really? Oh, wow.
He's immigrated to the United States. And he's considered like the father of American public relations and marketing.
Right.
Which is, it was fascinating to learn about this guy because he basically took Sigmund Freud's work and then exploited it to exploit the population.
Oh, wow.
And I believe Sigmund Freud was horrified by all of this and kind of saw it coming. Mm-hmm. And it also turns out, by the way, just as a side note, that the Nazis, Goebbels, who was the sort of propagandist for the Nazis, he studied Bernays extensively and used the same techniques.
Because Goebbels is considered a propaganda genius in a bad way,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So think about that. Like the guy who founded our marketing apparatus, essentially in the United States, is the same guy that Goebbels was a student of, not directly, but reading his work. So the difference is it wasn't political propaganda. It was just convincing people that they needed stuff that they don't need.
Yeah.
There was a point in time, this gives you a time frame for Bernays. He was around when women were trying to get the right to vote, the suffrage movement. And there were women who were, so at the time, this is probably 20 or 1918 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And there were these marches that were happening for the right to vote. And the American tobacco industry realized that women didn't smoke cigarettes. Men did. And so there was they could double their market share by getting women to smoke.
Right.
So they hired Edward Bernays, and he called a press conference about women's suffrage, and he had these, suffragists that were there.
Yeah.
And they were smoking cigarettes, and they called the cigarettes their torches of freedom.
Wow.
And so it launched this movement for women who wanted the right to vote to start smoking cigarettes as a symbol.
Mm-hmm. Of freedom?
Political symbol of freedom, of having the right to vote.
And that's the thing. I mean, that's, if you think about it, that's genius, and in a bad way. But if you got creative minds, if you got a creative mind like that, please use it the right way at least, But that's actually a very genius way of doing it. And
the point is that if they're able to convince us to byproducts with these kinds of techniques to get women to start smoking cigarettes, for example. It's very possible to use these same techniques to convince people about what life should look like.
Yeah. What the American dream is supposed to be and stuff. Yeah.
There was Goebbels, who was considered a mastermind of propaganda for the Nazis. He was a student of Edward Bernays, and you think about the impact that voice had on German society. German people, I mean, let's face it, smart people.
Yeah.
Einstein came from there.
Yeah.
So many things.
He did.
Innovations have come out of German thinkers, and but he convinced a significant portion of society that Jews were their mortal enemy and that they needed to attack other countries and stuff like that. So the point is, like, to your point about what middle class or working class people in this country are worried about. Well, to be frank, based on psychology and who owns the apparatuses of messaging, the media and whatnot, that, of course, they're going to, more or less, they're being manipulated. They're being told what to think and believe for the most part. And so, the only way out is like serious critical thinking and
be skeptical and learn how to ask the right questions. And like I said, it's critical thinking is a skill. It's something you don't just pick it up and start going with it. It's just not how we do things. It's no different than any other skill you have to learn. It takes time. It's a lifelong skill, and you just get better at it, but you never perfect it. Yeah.
So I think that's what we're hoping to do here on the Substack, or on the Collapse Curriculum podcast here, and on my Substack, is have these conversations. And it's good to have you here to be able to go back and forth and discuss these things, because I think it's easy to talk in a bubble with other people who are already thinking about collapse, but it's good we got to extend that bubble. Get people considering what is happening. So next time on the podcast, we'll get into, we talked about, the history of collapsing societies and kind of how those trends or threads mirror today. But what are the present trends?
Right.
We can talk more about climate change. We can talk more about the limits of the finite planet and the thresholds that we've been crossing.
Right.
So,
good.
So I appreciate you joining me today for this first episode.
You bet. No, it was great. I love talking about these things, and I love what you're doing. So any way I can help. All right. Thanks, Justin. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.